August 7th, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy whispered with death. Dawn had barely broken when the first rumble of engines shattered the uneasy silence. American Shermans, their turrets low, moved like predators through the narrow lanes carved by centuries of French farmers. The fog of morning clung to the earth, muffling sound, bending light, making steel phantoms of the approaching columns. German outposts, exhausted and thin, strained their eyes across the mist. Then sudden thunder, the crack of high-velocity shells, the scream of incoming artillery, the roar of aircraft diving from above. The battlefield erupted, and in that instant German commanders felt the edges of a nightmare closing in. At Mortain, on the western flank of the Allied advance, Hitler had demanded the impossible. His generals, hardened by years on the Eastern Front, were ordered to cut through to Avranches and sever the American spearhead. The Führer believed the Americans were brittle, that one sharp blow could shatter their lines and turn Normandy into another Dunkirk. What his generals witnessed instead was a force that no longer fought like an amateur army. They saw speed, precision, and above all, connection, an enemy that seemed to act as a single organism, reacting faster than orders could be written, shifting weight before the Germans could strike, countering blows before they fully landed. The German offensive began with fire and fury. Panzers rolled forward, their tracks grinding the soil, their crews braced with grim determination. The Tiger tanks, those steel behemoths that had terrorized battlefields from Kursk to Kharkov, advanced with confidence. In their minds, the Shermans were nothing more than cannon fodder. Yet as they moved, something was wrong. Ambushes appeared from nowhere. Artillery fell with uncanny precision, not in scattered salvos, but in coordinated barrages that pinned entire formations. Radio chatter inside German units grew frantic. How were the Americans shifting so quickly? How did they always seem to know where the blow would land? A German major, crouched in his command vehicle, slammed a fist into the table as another message arrived. The Americans were not just holding, they were counterattacking from multiple directions. He tried to re-establish contact with flanking units, but silence answered. Lines of communication had collapsed into chaos, while across the hedgerows, American units were speaking as if with one voice, moving in harmony, tank crews and infantry linked by an invisible web. In that moment, what German officers had dismissed as a clumsy, inexperienced foe revealed itself as something else entirely, an army that had mastered a weapon the Germans had underestimated, the power of seamless coordination. As the day bled into night, the battle became a nightmare of confusion for the Wehrmacht. Jagged Panther crews fired into shadows, only to be flanked. Supply trucks, already stretched thin, were ambushed before reaching the front. Pilots returning from the Luftwaffe's desperate strikes reported skies filled with swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, each dive and strafing run timed with eerie synchronization to the American ground movements below. It was as though the enemy's every arm, armor, infantry, artillery, and air, were guided by a single brain. The realization began to dawn in the minds of German commanders. This was not the same America they had mocked in 1942. This was a war machine, tuned and sharpened, learning at a speed that defied expectation. The soldiers on the ground felt it most viscerally. German infantrymen, veterans of Stalingrad and Sicily, clutched their rifles in disbelief as American units shifted formations mid-battle with uncanny timing. They whispered rumors of new American weapons, some hidden trick of technology that let their enemy respond faster than humanly possible. When Tiger IIs bogged down in the soft soil, American artillery zeroed in within minutes. When German armor tried to mass for a push, American forces dispersed, only to reassemble on the flank before the panzers could react. Every move seemed countered before it began, every plan unraveling in real time. Fear seeped in, the fear of an enemy that could see everything. In the command tents, German generals pored over maps stained with sweat and mud. They had seen stubborn resistance before, but this was different. Their attacks were dissolving, not through sheer firepower, but through a kind of battlefield intelligence the Germans had never encountered at this scale. Reports streamed in of American units communicating across miles of front, as if there were no barriers at all. Orders were relayed instantly, corrections made within moments, reserves deployed exactly where they were needed. Against such fluidity, the German concept of Auftragstaktik, the cherished doctrine of independent initiative, was being turned against them. Their once revered flexibility was now smothered by an opponent who was faster still. Night fell heavy on Morton, yet the sky burned with flares and tracer fire. German tanks, isolated and blind, became easy prey. Crews abandoned their vehicles in the dark, listening to the relentless hum of American engines circling the battlefield. Survivors later described the feeling as fighting a ghost. Every time they struck at the Americans, the enemy dissolved, only to appear where they were weakest. It was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the manifestation of a new kind of war. War fought not just with steel and courage, but with the invisible power of connection. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. The German counterattack had failed. Worse, it had exposed a terrifying shift in the balance of the war. For the first time, German generals admitted to themselves that the Americans were not simply resilient, they were evolving into something unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had once believed that technical superiority in armor and experience in maneuver would guarantee victory. But at Mortain they learned a harsher lesson. America's advantage was not just in numbers or factories. It was in the way those numbers, those machines, and those men could be bound together by an unseen thread. And once that thread tightened, it created a force that could not be broken. The fields of Normandy, drenched in blood and smoke, bore silent witness to the revelation. German soldiers limped back from the wreckage, haunted by the memory of an enemy that moved like a single organism, striking with precision no human eye could match. Generals stared at their broken maps and realized that the old equations of war, tank against tank, division against division, no longer applied. America had found its edge, and in doing so, had signaled the beginning of the end for the Reich. The day German generals realized America could not be defeated was not marked by a single explosion, nor by the fall of a city. It was marked by the shattering of an illusion, the belief that the Americans were slow, clumsy, and naive. At Mortain, that illusion died in fire and steel, replaced by the grim truth of a new reality. The enemy was not only strong, the enemy was learning. And for the first time in the war, the guardians of the Reich looked across the battlefield and felt something they had not known in years: inevitability. By 1944, the war had entered its most decisive phase. The Allies had stormed ashore in Normandy and broken through the Atlantic Wall, but the outcome was far from certain. To the east, the Red Army's vast tide was surging westward, hammering Army Group Center into ruin during Operation Bagration. In Italy, Allied divisions clawed their way up the mountainous spine of the peninsula, facing fanatical resistance at every turn. And in France, the battle for Normandy was transforming from a clash of armies into a war of annihilation, fought among hedgerows, villages, and rolling fields that became death traps for both man and machine. The Germans, even in their weakened state, believed they still possessed the edge in tactics and experience. Their panzer divisions were hardened by years of brutal combat. They were led by commanders who had studied maneuver warfare since the days of Guderian, men who had executed lightning strikes from Warsaw to Kiev, who had humbled entire armies with the speed of their blitzkrieg. Their armor, Panthers, Tigers, and Jagdpanthers, outclassed the American Sherman in firepower and armor. Their doctrine, rooted in Auftragstactik, emphasized initiative, independence, and the ability to strike with precision. Against this, they saw the Americans as inexperienced and clumsy, reliant on overwhelming numbers rather than skill. But 1944 was not 1940. The United States had transformed itself into an industrial colossus, producing war material on a scale that dwarfed even the most ambitious German forecasts. By this point, American factories were churning out 50,000 aircraft a year, tens of thousands of tanks and trucks, and millions of tons of supplies. Yet sheer numbers alone did not explain the growing unease in German command reports. Something deeper was happening on the battlefield. The Americans were not simply flooding the front with machines, they were learning how to use them in ways that defied German expectations. At the heart of this transformation lay doctrine and communication. The U.S. Army in its early days in North Africa had stumbled badly. At Kasserine Pass in 1943, American units were routed by Erwin Rommel's battle-hardened veterans. German commanders walked away from that victory, convinced the Americans lacked discipline, cohesion, and fighting spirit. Reports described them as too dependent on rigid orders, unable to adapt when plans unraveled. Yet in the months that followed, the Americans absorbed their defeats and rebuilt their doctrine from the ground up. They emphasized combined arms, tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft working together in a seamless whole. They refined coordination drills, trained officers to rely on initiative, and most critically, they invested in the unseen lifeline that bound their army together: battlefield communication. German intelligence officers began noticing troubling signs in 1943. After-action reports described American artillery as unnervingly fast, reacting within minutes to shifting threats. Tanks maneuvered with a coordination that seemed unnatural. Infantry attacks coincided with armored thrusts and airstrikes, as though guided by one hand. To the Germans, who had relied for years on the carefully orchestrated ballet of blitzkrieg, this was deeply unsettling. They had always prized speed and surprise, but now they faced an enemy that was beginning to move faster still, not because of superior tanks or aircraft, but because of something intangible: information. By the summer of 1944, the contrast between the two armies had become stark. German panzer divisions, once the cutting edge of modern warfare, were increasingly hamstrung by logistical collapse. Allied bombing campaigns had shredded rail networks, leaving German units short of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. Radios, already scarce in German formations, were failing under the strain of combat. Many German tanks operated with only basic communication, leaving coordination to hand signals or runner dispatches. By contrast, nearly every American tank, half-track, and command vehicle carried a reliable radio set. The effect was revolutionary. Orders could be transmitted instantly across units, reserves could be redirected in minutes, and artillery could shift fire at a speed that seemed supernatural to those on the receiving end. The Germans entered Normandy expecting to face an army of brute force, one that would hammer forward in clumsy assaults. Instead, they encountered an enemy that fought as though it were a single organism. Reports from officers at Mortain spoke of American formations that seemed to anticipate German moves before they happened, countering thrusts with uncanny precision. Some commanders dismissed it as coincidence. Others suspected their plans were being betrayed by spies or reconnaissance aircraft. But as the pattern repeated across battle after battle, a grim realization began to settle in. The Americans were no longer amateurs. They were becoming masters of the battlefield in ways the Germans could not match. Strategically, this shift could not have come at a worse time for the Reich. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was being consumed by the Red Army's relentless hammer blows. Germany needed the Western Front to hold, to buy time for new miracle weapons and diplomatic maneuvers that might force a negotiated peace. But the Americans, with their relentless logistical engine and rapidly evolving tactics, were making that impossible. Each counterattack from Mortain to the Falaise Pocket ended not just in failure but in catastrophe. The German generals knew it. They could read it in their casualty reports, in the crumbling state of their supply lines, and in the haunted eyes of their troops. The broader context was grim. Hitler's strategic vision had collapsed into fantasy. He ordered offensives that could not be supplied, demanded attacks with divisions that no longer existed on paper. His generals, men like von Kluge and Model, obeyed with clenched teeth, knowing they were sacrificing what little strength remained. Against this backdrop, the Americans pressed forward, not with reckless speed, but with methodical coordination. Their advance was relentless, not because they were superior in individual combat, but because they never fought as isolated units. Every platoon was part of a larger whole, every tank connected by invisible threads of communication to the wider machine. By August, when the German counterattack at Mortain collapsed, the truth was undeniable. The United States had emerged as the decisive power in the West. Its men, its machines, and its doctrine had matured into something that could not be broken by experience or tactics alone. The Germans still had formidable weapons, still had commanders of skill and cunning, but they were fighting against time, against numbers, and against an enemy that had mastered the art of coordination in a way that rendered traditional German advantages obsolete. In the end, the historical context of 1944 was more than just the backdrop to a single battle. It was the stage on which the illusion of German invincibility finally crumbled. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting terrible casualties, but its aura of superiority, its myth of tactical dominance, was shattered by an opponent it had once scorned. The Americans had not only caught up, they had surpassed, and in doing so, they had rewritten the balance of power in the European theatre. The German staff officers who had once dismissed the Americans as amateurs now found themselves staring at reports that made no sense. Panzer battalions described being pinned down by artillery that seemed to shift targets with uncanny speed. Armored columns swore that Shermans appeared on their flanks before reconnaissance could even warn of an approach. Luftwaffe pilots, already outnumbered, returned to base bewildered by the coordination between American fighters and ground units. Something invisible was guiding the enemy's hand, some hidden factor turning what should have been chaos into symphony. The question echoing in command tents from Mortain to Falaise was simple. How? For months, the Germans had believed the key to victory remained the same as it had in Poland and France. Superior tactics, seasoned commanders, and weapons that inspired fear. Their panzers carried thicker armor and longer guns. Their infantry battalions drilled in discipline and initiative. Their staff officers knew the rhythms of war better than any adversary alive. Yet those advantages seemed to evaporate the moment they met American forces in Normandy. The Shermans were still technically inferior machines, their armor vulnerable, their firepower modest. But they moved with precision, fought with coordination, and struck with timing that could not be explained by training alone. The answer lay in something the Germans had overlooked: radios. Not just any radios, but frequency modulation sets that gave the Americans an advantage, as decisive as a new weapon. While German tanks relied on older amplitude modulation systems, plagued by static, interference, and unreliability, the Americans had quietly equipped nearly every armored vehicle, half-track and command jeep with robust FM radios. It was a revolution hidden in plain sight, where the Wehrmacht still fought with the assumption that units would often be blind, relying on prearranged orders or the initiative of commanders cut off from higher command. The Americans operated as though their entire army was plugged into a single nervous system. The Germans noticed it first in the speed of American artillery. A company pinned in the hedgerows could call for fire support and receive it within minutes. Batteries dozens of kilometers away adjusted trajectories almost instantly, guided by crisp transmissions that cut through weather and battlefield noise. German officers were astonished. Their own artillery, formidable when coordinated in advance, lagged far behind in responsiveness. Runners had to carry messages, lines had to be laid, orders had to climb and descend the chain of command. The Americans seemed to bypass all of that. A lieutenant in a foxhole could speak to a captain miles away as though they stood shoulder to shoulder. Tank combat revealed the difference even more starkly. German crews often fought as isolated hunters, powerful individually but blind when separated from their commanders. If a panzer platoon leader was knocked out, the rest of the unit could flounder, unable to receive new orders. American tankers, by contrast, remained in constant communication. Every Sherman in a platoon could speak to every other, adjusting tactics on the fly. If a commander fell, another took his place instantly, coordination intact. To the Germans, this was maddening. Their doctrine of Auftragstactik had long prided itself on flexibility and initiative. Now they were facing an enemy who could achieve the same adaptability, not through individual genius, but through a system that made adaptability universal. Captured German diaries and reports revealed the growing disbelief. One officer wrote that the Americans fight like ants, moving in unison as if with one mind. Another complained that attacks collapse before they begin, because the enemy shifts forces faster than our orders can arrive. Rumors spread of American spies, of advanced knowledge of German plans, but the truth was both simpler and more devastating. It was not espionage, but technology. The SCR-508 radio, standard in American tanks, allowed platoons to react in seconds. The SCR-300 backpack set linked infantry squads to armor and artillery. Together they gave the U.S. Army something the Germans had once possessed and then lost: the ability to orchestrate war as if conducting an orchestra. The hidden advantage extended beyond the battlefield into logistics. German supply officers wrestled with broken lines, convoys ambushed, because orders to reroute never arrived. American supply chains, by contrast, hummed with coordination. Truck drivers knew instantly where fuel and ammunition were needed. Engineers could be summoned to repair bridges within hours. Commanders at every level had real-time updates of their units' positions and status. To a German general accustomed to delays, confusion, and improvisation, this efficiency was infuriating. The Americans seemed to erase the fog of war, if not entirely, then enough to tilt every engagement in their favor. The psychological effect was perhaps the most devastating of all. German soldiers, who had once mocked the Sherman as a Tommy cooker, now found themselves outmaneuvered and surrounded by those very machines. They began to fear not just the tanks themselves, but the unseen hand guiding them. Every explosion, every sudden shift in firepower, carried with it the suspicion that the Americans were everywhere, watching, coordinating, speaking to one another through the ether. Morale cracked not because of overwhelming firepower, though that too played its part, but because the enemy seemed to fight in ways the Germans could not match nor even fully understand. For the German High Command, the revelation was humiliating. They had prided themselves on innovation, on leading the world in military technology. They had pioneered the Blitzkrieg, the marriage of radios and maneuver in 1940, yet by 1944 they had been overtaken. Their own Fuji-5 sets, limited in range and prone to interference, lagged hopelessly behind the American FM systems. Worse, shortages meant that not every vehicle could even be equipped. Many German units went into battle with commanders carrying radios, while subordinates relied on hand signals, flags, or shouted commands, anachronisms on a modern battlefield. Against an enemy whose every squad leader could whisper orders into the dark, it was suicide. The hidden advantage was now in plain view. America's strength was not merely in its factories, nor in its numbers, nor even in the courage of its soldiers. It was in the ability to link those elements together, to turn an army of millions into a single, responsive entity. German generals, veterans of 2 world wars, found themselves staring at a new form of warfare that rendered their experience obsolete. They had built tanks with thicker armor and longer guns. They had perfected doctrines that emphasized speed and autonomy. But none of it mattered when their enemy could see faster, speak faster, and move faster than they could react. By the late summer of 1944, the realization had sunk in. The Americans had found their hidden edge, and it was one the Germans could not copy quickly enough to matter. The Reich's factories were bombed to rubble, its fuel supplies dwindling, its divisions shattered. Even if they had recognized the significance of FM radios years earlier, they no longer had the capacity to mass-produce them. What they faced instead was a cruel inversion of their own blitzkrieg, an opponent who wielded speed and coordination as ruthlessly as the Wehrmacht once had, but on a scale the Germans could never hope to match. The story of America's hidden advantage was not written only in blood and smoke on the battlefield. It was also written in solder, vacuum tubes, and factory assembly lines. To understand why German generals felt blindsided in 1944, one must step away from the hedgerows of Normandy and into the humming workshops of Motorola, Signal Corps laboratories, and Detroit assembly lines where engineering met necessity. The technical revolution that shaped the battlefield was not a weapon of steel or explosive. It was a device that fit inside a metal box, weighing less than 200 pounds, yet altering the rhythm of war itself. The SCR-508, the standard radio mounted in American tanks, represented the culmination of years of experimentation. It was not glamorous. To the untrained eye, it was simply a tangle of wires and vacuum tubes encased in drab metal. But its secret lay in the principle of frequency modulation. Unlike the German Fuji-5 amplitude modulation radios, which were vulnerable to static, weather interference, and overlapping signals, the SCR-508 cut through battlefield noise with clarity. Its 25-watt output could transmit crisp commands across ranges of up to 10 miles, even through the thunder of artillery and the interference of engines. For a tank crew in combat, that clarity was life itself. Each set contained thousands of components, resistors, capacitors, tubes, all produced in staggering numbers by America's industrial base. Factories in Illinois, New Jersey, and Ohio retooled to produce radios in assembly line fashion, the same way Ford had once rolled out automobiles. Motorola, then a rising company, became a cornerstone of the war effort, producing reliable sets that could be installed in everything from Sherman tanks to half-tracks. Unlike the Germans, who struggled to maintain production amid Allied bombing and resource shortages, the Americans flooded the battlefield with radios until even the smallest units were never out of contact. The SCR-300 backpack radio was equally revolutionary. Known to GIs as the walkie-talkie, it weighed 35 pounds and could be carried by a single infantryman. Its range of 3 to 5 miles allowed platoon leaders to maintain direct contact with supporting armor and artillery. For the first time in history, a lieutenant crouching in a ditch could call down a barrage from guns miles away or coordinate with tanks moving through a nearby village. The Germans, who often relied on flares, whistles, or runners to communicate under fire, could only marvel and despair at such immediacy. To appreciate the scale of the transformation, one must consider the numbers. By 1944, the US Army had deployed over 50,000 SCR-508 tank radios and nearly 100,000 SCR-300 backpack sets across Europe. Entire divisions were blanketed in communication. German panzer divisions, by comparison, remained riddled with gaps. Only command tanks carried radios capable of reliable transmission. Many subordinate vehicles had receivers but no transmitters. Infantry units were even worse off, often going into battle with a handful of portable sets that crackled with interference. The gap was not marginal. It was systemic, an advantage multiplied across every level of the battlefield. Even the specifications told a story of superiority. The German Fu-G5 radio operated at a power of 10 watts, with a maximum reliable range of 2 to 3 miles under ideal conditions. Its AM transmission was easily drowned out by weather or overlapping signals, and it required skilled operators to maintain. The SCR-508, by contrast, delivered over twice the output, with crystal-controlled stability that prevented drifting frequencies. Maintenance could be handled by ordinary signalmen, and replacement parts were abundant. The US did not just design a better radio, they designed one that could be mass-produced, maintained, and used by a conscript army with minimal training. Behind every set was an army of engineers. Edwin Armstrong, the American inventor of FM technology, had fought for years to prove its value. The Signal Corps, recognizing its potential, adopted it just in time for the war. Motorola engineers worked day and night to refine the ruggedness of their equipment, testing radios in freezing conditions, desert heat, and the chaos of tank interiors. By the time the Normandy campaign began, the equipment was not just functional, it was battle-proven. The Germans, once leaders in radio technology, had fallen behind, unable to overcome the inertia of older systems and the bottlenecks of their war economy. The technical advantage also reshaped doctrine. American commanders could now experiment with decentralized control, knowing that units would never be truly isolated. Patton's Third Army, famous for its rapid maneuvers, owed its speed not only to fuel and aggressive leadership, but also to radios that allowed columns to adjust their routes in real time. Eisenhower's staff could coordinate entire corps across hundreds of miles, redirecting thrusts when opportunities arose. The Germans still relied on the slower rhythm of pre-planned orders. In the chaos of Normandy's hedgerows, that delay was fatal. Consider the battlefield application. A Sherman platoon advancing through a village comes under fire from a concealed Panther. Within seconds, the platoon commander radios coordinates to nearby artillery. In less than 10 minutes, shells rain down, suppressing the threat. Simultaneously, the commander alerts infantry on the flank and reroutes his own tanks around the ambush. What could have been a massacre instead becomes a coordinated counterattack. For German crews, the effect was bewildering. How could the enemy react with such speed? The answer was a box of wires humming in the turret of every tank. The Germans recognized the danger too late. Reports circulated warning of the Americans' unusual coordination. Technical officers urged Berlin to accelerate FM radio development, but it was already beyond reach. Allied bombers had devastated factories, copper and other materials were in short supply, and time itself was slipping away. Even if they had produced a rival set, distributing it across the Wehrmacht would have been impossible by 1944. Their armies were retreating, their supply lines strangled, their soldiers exhausted. Radios could not save them now. The story of the radios is also the story of America's industrial miracle. Unlike Germany, which pursued technological marvels in small batches, Tigers, jet fighters, V-weapons, the United States pursued reliable, scalable solutions. Radios were not designed to be the most advanced, but to be plentiful and durable. Every tank got one, every platoon could count on them. That philosophy, rooted in mass production, turned an army of individuals into a collective machine, and that machine ground forward across France, one transmission at a time. In retrospect, the technical specifications might seem dry, watts, ranges, components, but on the battlefield, they meant life and death. They meant the difference between an ambushed column annihilated in silence and a column that called down artillery within minutes. They meant the difference between isolated courage and coordinated strength. To the German generals staring at their maps in the summer of 1944, those numbers translated into something chilling: inevitability. By the time the Allies broke out of Normandy and raced toward Paris, the technical edge of American radios had become more than a battlefield curiosity. It was the backbone of operational success. German generals could see it plainly. Their tanks were stronger, their crews were experienced, but their armies were deaf. The Americans, once mocked for their clumsiness, now spoke with a voice that carried across miles, binding their scattered divisions into a single, unstoppable tide. The age of silent war was over. The age of connected war had begun. September 18, 1944. The rolling fields near Haraucourt in the Lorraine region of France shimmered under a grey sky heavy with rain. The earth was soft, churned by weeks of combat, and mist clung to the low valleys like smoke from invisible fires. For the Germans, this was the moment to strike back. 44 Panther tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade rumbled forward, their long 75mm guns poised to tear open the American line. The men inside were veterans, confident in their machine's superiority. To them, the Sherman was still the Tommy Cooker, a weak and clumsy adversary that burst into flames at the first touch of a Panther shell. Yet within hours, that confidence would give way to disbelief, confusion, and ultimately despair. The battle began with thunder. German artillery opened fire, pounding suspected American positions. Panthers advanced in a spearhead, cutting across the fields in near silence, except for the growl of engines. The terrain favored them, open ground where their long-range guns could dominate. American units, scattered and seemingly vulnerable, appeared to be caught unprepared. But what unfolded next shocked the German officers watching from their command posts. Instead of crumbling under the assault, the Americans vanished into the mist, only to reappear on the Panthers' flanks with uncanny precision. German tanks, lighter and slower firing, should have been easy prey, yet they struck with coordination that defied German expectations. Platoons shifted like shadows, one unit drawing fire while another looped around unseen, guided by constant chatter over radios. Artillery barrages fell almost instantly, where German armor massed, breaking up formations before they could press home their attack. American tank destroyers, the nimble M18 Hellcats, darted across the battlefield at speeds the Germans had never encountered before, ambushing Panthers from angles impossible to anticipate. Every German move seemed anticipated, countered, undone before it could take shape. By midday, the clash had become a slaughter, but not in the way the Germans had imagined. The Panthers, technically superior in gun and armor, found themselves isolated, outmaneuvered, and picked apart. At least 39 German tanks were destroyed in the Haraucourt fighting, many of them burning wrecks abandoned by their crews in the mud. American losses were lighter. Sherman's had indeed fallen, some in flames, but the ratio stunned German intelligence. How could inferior machines prevail with such efficiency against their best armor? The answer, as German survivors later admitted, was not luck. It was communication, coordination, and the invisible threads of radio that bound every American unit into a single organism. Reports from the German side reveal the growing panic. One panzer officer described the battle as fighting a swarm of ghosts. Another wrote that American artillery seems to follow our movements before they occur. The Panthers' long guns, lethal at a distance, were useless when enemy tanks struck from the flanks and then disappeared, replaced moments later by artillery fire. Worse still, fog and low clouds denied the Luftwaffe any meaningful role. American aircraft, on the other hand, appeared in short bursts, dive-bombing with precision before vanishing again. Every branch of the American army, armor, artillery, infantry, and air, moved in terrifying synchronization. The battle did not end in a single day. For nearly a week, German forces tried again and again to dislodge the Americans at Aracourt. Each attempt ended the same way. German thrusts blunted by rapid artillery, tanks picked off by Hellcats, infantry scattered by coordinated counterattacks. By September 25th, the German 113th Panzer Brigade had been mauled beyond recognition. Of its armored strength, more than half lay wrecked on the battlefield. American units, though battered, held firm. When the smoke cleared, the Americans had inflicted one of the most lopsided defeats of the war in terms of tank combat. To the German generals, the implications were devastating. They had relied on their technological edge to offset Allied numbers. The Panther, with its sloped armor and powerful gun, was supposed to dominate. Yet at Aracourt, numbers and firepower meant nothing against an enemy that fought as a cohesive whole. American units did not need to win duels tank for tank. They won through coordination, using radios to concentrate fire, call down support, and execute flanking maneuvers with lethal speed. What should have been a showcase of German superiority became a demonstration of American dominance in the art of connected war. For the Americans, Aracourt became a proving ground. It showed their troops that discipline and communication could overcome fear and technical inferiority. Tank crews who once dreaded the sight of a Panther now realized that by working together, by maintaining constant contact, they could bring down even the most fearsome opponent. Infantry squads gained confidence, knowing that artillery was only a call away. Commanders learned that they could shift reserves with fluidity, plugging gaps before they widened into disasters. The battle validated the doctrine that had been forged in Tunisia and Sicily. Combined arms warfare, powered by communication, was the path to victory. Even German after-action reports admitted as much. Officers noted with bitterness that American units react with speed that should not be possible. They marveled and despaired at the way artillery barrages arrived within minutes of being requested, while German batteries sometimes took hours to reposition. They observed that American tanks rarely operated in isolation, always appearing in coordinated groups, each one supporting the other. What they had once considered a weakness, America's reliance on mass production and simple machines, was revealed as strength. The simplicity of the Sherman allowed for numbers, and radios made those numbers deadly. The defeat at Aracourt carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. It shattered German illusions of regaining the initiative in Lorraine. It eroded morale among panzer crews who realized their vaunted machines could be neutralized by an enemy they had underestimated. It forced generals to confront a grim truth. The Americans were not only learning, they were perfecting their craft at a pace the Germans could not match. Each battle added to their experience, each victory refined their doctrine, and each destroyed panzer testified to the futility of resisting an enemy who fought as one. As the autumn rains fell and the fields of Lorraine filled with rusting wreckage, the lesson became clear. The Germans could no longer rely on the superiority of their tanks, their tactics, or their commanders. The Americans had found their hidden advantage, and at Aracourt they revealed it in devastating fashion. The battlefield was not decided by the thickness of armor or the length of a gun barrel, but by the ability to connect, to react, to strike as a unified whole. And in that unity lay the inevitability of Germany's defeat. The defeat at Aracourt did more than burn German tanks into the soil of Lorraine. It carved doubt into the minds of German generals who had once believed in the supremacy of their doctrine. They had seen tactical setbacks before, reversals that could be explained away by bad weather, poor reconnaissance, or the overwhelming weight of enemy numbers. But the pattern emerging across France in the summer and autumn of 1944 could no longer be dismissed as chance. Something fundamental had shifted. The Americans, who had stumbled so clumsily at Kasserine Pass, were now orchestrating their movements with a speed and fluidity that seemed impossible to match. This realization carried not only strategic consequences, but a psychological toll that rippled from the highest command posts down to the men in the trenches. Strategically, the hidden American advantage reshaped the battlefield into something the Germans had never truly faced. In earlier years, the Wehrmacht's strength lay in its ability to fracture opponents by decapitating their command structures. A single well-aimed strike could leave enemy battalions leaderless orders delayed and units paralyzed. But in Normandy, Brittany and Lorraine, the Americans proved immune to such dismemberment. Knock out a command tank, and another officer instantly assumed control, seamlessly connected through the invisible lifeline of FM radios. Overrun a company headquarters, and platoons continued to fight in coordination, guided by constant communication across the net. The Americans had engineered redundancy into their very command structure. Where German formations collapsed in isolation, the Americans endured through connection. This resilience spread confusion among German commanders. Reports noted with frustration that American artillery seemed to materialize wherever needed, even when communications should have been severed. German platoons learned the hard way that an enemy position which appeared vulnerable could suddenly summon reinforcements within minutes. Entire offensives faltered because American forces redirected reserves with uncanny precision. For generals raised on the doctrine of off-tracks tactic, where initiative and speed of thought were decisive, the spectacle of an entire enemy army moving faster than their own officers could issue orders was nothing short of humiliating. The psychological reversal was profound. The very weapon that had made the Wehrmacht feared in 1940 was now being wielded more effectively by the Americans in 1944. On the ground, the impact was even more corrosive to morale. German tank crews, once the predators of the battlefield, began to feel hunted. The Panther's thick armor offered no comfort when artillery could be called down with pinpoint accuracy. Jagdpanther ambushes lost their sting when American units simply shifted routes and enveloped them from the sides. For infantry, the terror was constant. Small squads huddled in hedgerows could not understand how their positions were so quickly targeted. Whispers spread of American reconnaissance planes guiding every strike, or of traitors in French villages feeding intelligence to the enemy. The truth that it was radios in every platoon, every jeep, every tank was more frightening still. It meant the Americans didn't need spies. They had built an army where every soldier was part of an unbreakable chain. Psychologically, this broke something in the Wehrmacht. Soldiers accustomed to operating with confidence in their commanders now found themselves isolated, their own radios crackling with static or falling silent altogether. Panic spread more easily when orders failed to arrive. Units that once held firm under artillery bombardment now dissolved, not only from firepower but from the conviction that the enemy was everywhere, always one step ahead. A sense of inevitability crept into the German ranks. They were no longer fighting an opponent they could outthink or outmaneuver. They were fighting an opponent that seemed omnipresent, omniscient, a machine made of men, steel, and invisible waves of communication. At higher levels, the psychological toll on generals was devastating. Von Kluge, Model, and others received casualty reports that defied explanation. Brigades of Panthers and Tigers, expected to halt American advances, were instead reduced to wreckage within days. Requests for reinforcements fell on deaf ears in Berlin, where Hitler's fantasies dictated orders disconnected from reality. The generals knew the truth. Their armies were bleeding out, not because of cowardice or incompetence, but because the enemy had found a way to negate their strengths. Pride turned to bitterness, bitterness to resignation. In private, some admitted that the Americans had solved the riddle of modern warfare. Publicly, they spoke only of holding on, even as the ground slipped away beneath them. The broader campaigns of 1944 illustrate the strategic impact vividly. During the breakout at Avranches, German attempts to seal the gap faltered because American units shifted directions faster than German reserves could respond. At Falaise, the pocket closed not merely through brute force, but through the coordination of infantry, armor, and air that crushed any attempt at escape. In Lorraine, the relentless tempo of Patton's Third Army defied the limits of fuel and logistics, its columns redirecting with a speed that baffled German intelligence. Each of these operations bore the fingerprints of a connected army. Each left the Germans more demoralized, more certain that they were facing something beyond their ability to counter. The psychological contrast between armies could not have been sharper. American soldiers, bolstered by the knowledge that they were never truly alone, fought with a confidence that grew with each battle. They knew artillery was only a radio call away, that tanks and planes were listening, ready to respond. This sense of connection bred resilience, turning ordinary men into a force greater than the sum of its parts. For the Germans, the opposite was true. Isolation bred fear, fear bred mistakes, and mistakes bred defeat. The Wehrmacht, once master of tempo, now staggered under the weight of an enemy that dictated the pace of war. By late 1944, the strategic and psychological impact was irreversible. German commanders no longer spoke of victory, only of delaying defeat. Their soldiers no longer marched with the swagger of conquerors, but with the hollow eyes of men fighting a war they knew could not be won. The Americans had not simply defeated them on the battlefield, they had broken their spirit. The unseen power of radios, multiplied by American industry and doctrine, had transformed the very psychology of war. No tank, no gun, no brilliant maneuver could undo the crushing weight of an opponent that moved as one. In the end, this was the most devastating consequence of all. The Germans had built their war machine on the premise that superior tactics and superior machines would always triumph. At Mortain, Aracourt, and countless other fields, they discovered that superiority no longer lay in steel alone. It lay in the bonds of communication, in the ability of an army to act not as fragments but as a whole. And once that truth became undeniable, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Reich could continue fighting, could continue bleeding, but deep inside its officer corps and among its weary soldiers, the realization had taken root. America could not be defeated, not because of numbers alone, but because it had mastered the art of connection, and with it, the very essence of modern war. In the smoking ruins of Lorraine, the shattered forests of the Ardennes, and the frozen plains of the Reich, the truth could no longer be denied. Germany's vaunted edge in tanks, tactics, and experience had been broken. What remained for its generals was the grim duty of acknowledging why. They had built war machines of terrifying power, Panthers, Tigers, jet fighters, ballistic missiles, but they had failed to build an army that could truly fight as one. The Americans had done precisely that, and in doing so, they had forged not only victory in Europe, but the blueprint for modern war. The legacy of this advantage rippled far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy. For Germany, it was a bitter lesson. In post-war interrogations, generals like Heinz Guderian and Albert Speer admitted what they had refused to say openly during the war. America's strength was not simply its factories, nor even the endless columns of Shermans pouring from Detroit. It was the ability to harness industry, technology, and doctrine into a unified system. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel confessed with bitterness, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." In those words lay the essence of the war's turning point. The Americans carried these lessons forward. The Cold War dawned not in silence, but in the hum of radios, the whisper of encrypted signals, the expansion of what had begun in the mud of Normandy. NATO doctrine enshrined the principle of networked warfare. Every unit connected, every commander informed, every battlefield linked. The radios that had guided Sherman crews in 1944 became the ancestors of satellite communication, data links, and integrated command systems. By the time American tanks thundered across the deserts of Kuwait in 1991, striking Iraqi armor with precision unheard of in World War II, the lineage was clear. The ghost of Aracourt lived on in the digital signals of GPS and laser-guided munitions. For veterans, the legacy was deeply personal. Men who had once crouched in foxholes with a radio handset clutched in their hands remembered the crackle of voices as lifelines. A single call could summon steel rain from the sky, could bring tanks charging to the rescue, could turn fear into resolve. They carried those memories home, telling families and communities that the war was not won by heroes in isolation, but by the invisible bonds that held them together. Connection, more than courage alone, had kept them alive. For Germany, the lesson became a warning etched into its post-war military thought. In the Bundeswehr, formed under NATO, the principle of seamless communication was elevated to doctrine. Never again would German tanks go to war half-deaf. Never again would infantry advance without lifelines to supporting arms. The bitter experience of 1944 had shown that even the most brilliant tactics collapse when isolated. Only by embracing connection could a modern army hope to survive. Yet the most enduring legacy of all was the transformation of how the world understood warfare itself. The 20th century had begun with armies marching in isolation, connected only by runners, flags, and bugle calls. It ended with armies that could see, speak, and strike across continents in real time. The seed of that transformation sprouted in World War II, in the unseen glow of vacuum tubes and the static-free clarity of FM radios. The day German generals realized America could not be defeated was the day the age of connected war was born. Even today, historians trace the line from those fields of France to the doctrines of the 21st century. Network-centric warfare, the doctrine that information is as decisive as firepower, is nothing more than an evolution of what the Americans discovered in 1944. Armies now fight as webs of connection, drones speaking to satellites, infantry relaying coordinates to aircraft thousands of feet above, commanders watching the battlefield unfold in digital clarity. In every transmission, every encrypted signal echoes the crackle of those first radios carried by GIs into the hedgerows. The lesson was not lost on adversaries either. The Soviet Union, studying American methods after the war, poured resources into command and control systems. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong learned to target American radios as a way to disrupt the lifelines that bound units together. In the Middle East, insurgents with improvised weapons learned that severing communication could unravel even the strongest formations. The battlefield had become not just a clash of tanks and guns, but a contest over connection itself. And yet, the essential truth remained unchanged. Firepower wins battles. Connection wins wars. Germany had the firepower. America had the connection. The results were written in the wreckage of the Wehrmacht from Normandy to the Rhine. The conclusion for military history, enthusiasts, veterans, and strategists alike, is stark. The myth of German invincibility was not destroyed by numbers alone, nor by brute industrial output. It was destroyed by a quiet revolution in how men spoke to one another in war. The Americans proved that courage magnified by coordination becomes unstoppable, that steel guided by shared vision becomes destiny. In that lesson lies the very soul of modern conflict. As the last months of World War II ground on, German generals fought not only the Allies, but the creeping realization that the war was already lost. Their reports grew shorter, their tone more resigned. They had seen it with their own eyes at Mortain, at Aracourt, at every failed counterstroke across France. The Americans were no longer a clumsy adversary. They were a force bound together, an army that could not be broken. The day German generals realized America could not be defeated was not marked by a single battle, nor a single weapon. It was marked by the recognition of inevitability. In the thunder of Shermans, in the relentless artillery, in the swarm of aircraft overhead, they heard more than firepower. They heard the voice of an army that spoke as one. And that is the final lesson. In modern war, strength is not the lone warrior nor the single mighty machine. It is the chorus of voices linked across miles, responding as one heartbeat, one will, one army. Germany learned it in 1944, too late to change the outcome. The world learned it in the decades that followed, building doctrines, technologies, and strategies on the foundation America had laid in blood and steel. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the deserts of Iraq, from the crackle of the SCR-508 to the hum of satellites orbiting the Earth, the truth endures. Firepower terrifies, connection conquers, and once an army learns to fight as one, it cannot be defeated.